The theory of man's rise to civilization is as mysterious as his origins. Ancient monuments around the world were built with such sophistication that they can hardly be duplicated today. Yet scientists continue to belittle these remarkable achievements.
I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods because I wasn't satisfied with the answers that were being given to me to a huge series of mysteries around this planet. Most mysterious of all, a series of ancient sites that have never been properly explained by historians. These sites I think of literally as the fingerprints of the gods, as marks left on our planet by a lost civilization that we have not yet properly identified. And amongst those sites, two in particular are extremely interesting. One is Giza in Egypt, where the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx stand. And on the other side of the Atlantic, on the other side of the world, is Tiwanaku in the high Andes in Bolivia.
In Tiwanaku, archaeologists have been surprised by the discovery of small metal clamps used to hold stones in place. Amazingly, these clamps were made from molten metal, poured into small molds carved in the ancient stone. But nearby lies evidence of an even greater feat of technology.
One of the most interesting things that has been found at the site have been what appear to be large stone molds. Apparently, they were pouring molten metal into these molds. This would be the pour hole, and you pour your molten metal in and fill it up. If it is a mold, then it's quite different from anything else we've seen in the Americas, and it would imply a far greater technology than we believed that they had at that time. We're talking about gallons of molten metal at a time, which indicates a high technology in the ability to utilize this molten metal in a mass amount.
All that we know about the people who built these monuments is what we can deduce from the monuments themselves. And if we look at these monuments with open minds and open eyes, we find something very interesting. Firstly, that the level of technology involved in creating them was high, the lifting and maneuvering of these huge blocks of stone. And secondly, that they incorporated fantastically accurate astronomical alignments, which could only have been the result of a very accurate observational science. So this is what the monuments tell us. They tell us that the people who built them were serious and intelligent people with a scientific outlook on life.
The ability of his mind to comprehend the very things that we comprehend today is there. He is us, and we are belittling him by making him less, because we have decided that, oh, this was his limitation, and we're belittling him because he was just as fervently intelligent as we are today, and that's obvious from the technology involved.
Civilization is not this linear progression. It's a roller coaster of peaks and valleys, of ages of science and enlightenment, and the sudden dark age and collapse of civilization. The question would be, how far back in time does our roller coaster of history go?
To find out how old an ancient civilization might be, archaeologists look to the monuments they left behind. But how do archaeologists determine when an ancient monument was built?
One of the most used tools in archaeology is dating with carbon-14. Carbon-14 is very good for dating bone or charcoal, but it doesn't work at all on dating stone. So when you go to a site and you find in association with the stone which you wish to date some carbon, such as a campfire site, and you date that carbon, you will get a date. But that date does not date the stone, it dates the campfire site. Now, was that campfire made by people who built the site, or was it made by people who later came to the site? Since we cannot rely completely upon the dating of the artifacts associated with the site, then we must look at the construction of the site itself. And the ancients constructed this site with astronomical alignments in mind. We can use those astronomical alignments to date the site today.
The first thing that one realizes when you look at the pyramids of Giza is that they're designed along astronomical principles. This is extremely obvious simply because the base of the pyramid, for example, square base, each side faces one of the cardinal points, east, west, north, and south, precisely. The precision is incredible. So it's clear that we're dealing with people who had astronomy in their mind. And we realize this very, very quickly when we look at the texts. The texts are really astronomical allegories. They speak of going to the stars, they speak of the sun, they speak of the moon, they speak everything to do with the sky. So we have to follow that with the science of astronomy. And the logic is to understand what precisely are they trying to tell us with this kind of architectural precision. And the breakthrough came, the first breakthrough came, when it was discovered that there was a shaft within the Great Pyramid pointing to the belt of Orion. So now we had a very clear link between the Gizeh necropolis and the belt of Orion. And that link, we understood it because the constellation of Orion was identified to the god of resurrection, Osiris. So this was the first breakthrough. The second breakthrough was to realize that the configuration of the three stars in Orion's belt were exactly the same as the configuration of the three pyramids of Giza. With that in mind, we had to carry on following the lead that they were giving us. And one of the major leads is that their whole effort, everything we know about pharaonic theocracy, their cult, the religion, the decrees of the king, everything they did was focused on what they called the first time, the time when their civilization began. So the next step was to see when was the beginning of the Orion cycle. And we used precession. We found out that it was in 10,500 BC. This led us to consider the whole arrangement of the sky in 10,500 BC. And we came with this absolutely amazing correlation. We found out that it was exactly at this time that the sun would rise at the vernal equinox. When we looked in that direction, we began to realize that they were drawing our attention to the direction of the alignment of the Sphinx. We have a Sphinx looking directly due east. And that is the big mystery. What does the Sphinx represent? Immediately we realized that the vernal equinox in 10,500 BC was the beginning of the age of Leo. So whether we like it or not, the science of astronomy is leading us to conclude that the Sphinx was carved in the 11th millennium. And we have to deal with that.
Many ancient cultures are said to have been destroyed by cataclysmic events. Could these events be explained by the theory of crustal displacement?
The Egyptians themselves tell us that their creation, their beginning, occurred after a great cataclysmic flood. Their land emerged from the waters. This date matches very well with the end of the Ice Age. It is very likely that we're looking at a civilization that has emerged from some great cataclysmic event, which in this case is probably a flood.
In my opinion, this whole mystery is closely tied up and interwoven with the mystery of the last Ice Age, and it really is a huge mystery. Everybody knows, we all learn it at school, that there was such a thing as an Ice Age. And it's very clearly established in the geological record that, for example, North America was covered with ice more than 2 miles thick, as far south as the Mississippi Delta, almost into the tropics. This ice was stable for more than 50,000 years. And then suddenly, and relatively recently, 15,000 years ago approximately, it all started to melt. And within just 2,000 years, that enormous mass of ice had completely melted down. Sea levels went up 400 or 500 feet around the world. No geologist has ever been able to explain why this happened, why the Ice Age ended so suddenly. But perhaps the answer lies in the theory of Earth crust displacement. Perhaps the reason that North America was covered with that mass of ice was because at that time it was situated much more closely to the North Pole than it is today. It was then shifted south into warmer latitudes by a displacement of the crust, and that would explain, naturally, why all that ice melted so rapidly, because it was in a much warmer climate.
In the early 1990s, some scientists from Australia discovered some beech trees 200 miles from the South Pole, which they dated to be 2 to 3 million years old. That is totally not understandable under our current assumptions about geology. Our current assumptions about geology would say that to move a continent like Antarctica to a place where it could produce beech trees would require 50, 60 million years. Now, these are only 2 to 3 million years. So what we're facing here is the need for another geological theory that could move a continent the size of Antarctica to a temperate zone under 2 million years. And that's where we believe the theory of Earth crust displacement comes in.
If there was an Earth crust displacement destroying most of the Earth's population, what happened to the survivors?
After the Earth crust displacement, some areas are completely uninhabitable. They go into the frozen polar zones, and nobody can survive there. However, there are some areas where people can survive. They tend to be in the highlands because people are afraid of staying in the lowlands where the tidal waves are devastating the shores. But in these particular areas that we can isolate using the theory of Earth crust displacement, we have oases of survival, and it's precisely in those locations that we find the earliest and most important crops. And it happens not just in one area, but all around the world. It's happening in South America, it's happening in Central America, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in the Middle East, it's happening in Asia, and it's all happening around that time. There's nothing that's really much older, but suddenly, after what we believe to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, of living by hunting and gathering, suddenly we begin to experiment with agriculture. It seems to me that all of this is much more than coincidence. We believe that an advanced civilization was destroyed. The survivors who had knowledge of agriculture brought that knowledge to the inhabitants of the local areas that happened to be ecologically stable and suitable for agriculture. And they brought that knowledge and they introduced it, and from that we ultimately got the rebirth of civilization.
It's pretty clear to me from the evidence that a common legacy of architectural knowledge was passed down from remote prehistory and spread out in very widely scattered locations around the world. Ask yourself this: if you belonged to a high civilization that had just been almost completely obliterated by a gigantic geological cataclysm, a movement of the crust of the Earth, what would you set out to do in the future? First of all, you would set out to create buildings that were extremely stable, that would survive the worst imaginable earthquake. And that's what we find in these fingerprints of a lost architectural knowledge all around the world. A fixation, a desire to create buildings that would last forever, no matter what happened to them. And another thing that we find is a focus on trying to predict when the cataclysm will recur. What has come down to us from the ancient past seems to be a message that by a close study of astronomical phenomena, it is possible to predict when the Earth will again be visited by this all-destroying cataclysm.
From the horizon of the past, the traditions and memories of visiting cosmic teachers has remained engraved in cultural art. This tradition dates from the era when spacecraft visited Earth from distant worlds. The ancient Indians of Peru were a highly advanced civilization who lived thousands of years ago in the jungle of South America. Their traditions speak of visiting spaceman. At their reservations are the amazing Nazca lines, which are etched into the earth and which are acknowledged as being aircraft runways and landing sites. Artifacts of great age have been found which closely resemble aircraft of today.